Staff of the Bank of Jamaica, our Department of Economics head, Dr. Nadine McLeod, lecturers, staff, students, other colleagues, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to the Department of Economics' first policy discussion for the year 2019. This is a series that we aim to hold throughout the year, each academic year, to bring to light different issues of policy that have implication or interest in the wider public. As you would have seen from the topic today, we're speaking about matters relating to monetary policy and their implication, their implementation, as far as it relates to the various monetary and governance arrangements that the Bank of Jamaica itself is currently contending with. You will see from our program that we have a wide range of representatives scheduled to make a presentation. And in particular, we have a distinguished guest from Mexico, one of our neighbors. We are interested in their experience because their move to do what we are trying to do presents some interesting precedents and lessons, in particular their adoption and implementation of inflation targeting, as well as the robust results that have flowed from this monetary regime in their context. So, and as an economy that is also closely linked to the USA, their experience with the exchange rate issues also have lessons for other open economies in the region. So my job here is just to let you know a short background of our various speakers so that I can allow them to speak freely and uninterrupted, and that you can then get into your questions and answers for them. So I'll begin with Dr. Ramos-Francia, who has been Chief Economist and Deputy Governor of Banco de Mexico. He's here to explain their experiences, and he also has expertise in the financial markets, both as an academic and practitioner. He's important to us in this region because in October last year, CEMLA, which is the Center for Macroeconomics in Latin America, has designated him as their Director General for a period of 5 years. Dr. Ramos-Francia has his degree, his economics PhD from Yale University, and he has had various research responsibilities within the Center for Analysis and Economic Research in Mexico, as well as having held several positions at the Ministry of Finance in Mexico. For example, as Deputy Minister, Chief Economist, and Chief Advisor to the Minister of Finance. His role at CEMLA is quite useful to us in the region because the Bank of Jamaica is also a member of that institution. And so his visit here in Jamaica generally is part of discussions that began when he was at the Banco de Mexico between himself and the central bank here in Jamaica as Deputy Governor. He's here to give us some perspective from Mexico, and we hope that his interaction with us, Jamaican academics, Jamaican business leaders, as well as other opinion and thought leaders, will help us to inform the discussion of the reforms that the BOJ is currently considering. Second on our program is Dr. Constant Lonkeng. He's a Cameroonian national and is the IMF representative here in Jamaica. He joined the IMF in 2010 through its Young Professional Program and has since worked in the Institute for Capacity Development, the Fiscal Affairs Department, the African Department, and now the Western Hemisphere Department. His own research has covered a range of issues, including the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy, fiscal anchors and risks, the use of dynamic general equilibrium models in policymaking, and the political economy of reforms. He has served as statistician at the National Institute of Cameroon earlier in his professional career. We also have our own Dr. Andre Haughton, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics here at UMona. He earned his PhD from the University of Sussex in UK, and he has a long list of scholarships that he has received, among which he is a British Commonwealth Scholar, and here at UWI, he was designated UWI's most outstanding researcher for 2017 for the Faculty of Social Sciences. He's also founder of the Valley Foundation, a charity organization, and he's the author of Developing Sustainable Balance of Payments in Small Countries, Lessons from the Macroeconomic Deadlock in Jamaica. And finally, last but not least, we have Mrs. Janelle Pantry-Coke, who is the founder and creative director of Spaces Limited, one of Kingston's leading retailers of quality furniture and accessories. She attended my alma mater, Campion College, and holds a degree in management studies with a specialization in tourism from UWI here at Mona. With over 10 years of retail and management experience, Janelle is recognized as a visionary and is a well-respected industry leader. Spaces is known for its contemporary furnishings and offers turnkey project services and installation through its Decor Center. Janelle is the contributing design editor for the Jamaica Observer and currently serves as the president of the Rotary Club of Trafalgar New Heights. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Manuel Ramos-Francia, the former Deputy Governor, Bank of Mexico, and Director General of CEMLA Mexico. Each presenter, we're asking you if you could present for 15 minutes so that we can take questions at length, hopefully at the end of all 4 presentations. Thank you. I think they might want to record from this mic.
No presentation. So, well, good evening, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a privilege. There you go. It's a privilege and an honor to be here. Thank you very much for Governor Winter for the invitation, and well, as I said, it's quite an honor. So let me, there are so many aspects to overall, let's say, monetary policy, of which one operating now I have to follow it. There you go. Okay. So there are many aspects to monetary policy in general that, you know, not only 15 minutes, but I think a lot more time would be needed. So let me concentrate on 2 things. One, of course, is what's being discussed here in Jamaica, which is using a particular operating scheme of monetary policy, which is inflation targeting. And let me talk a little bit about that. And then I'll talk about why many central bankers believe that this monetary operating scheme is possibly, given the characteristics of small open economies, possibly the best, and for trying to bring down inflation to a low stable level. And the second is why would possibly this be preferable under many circumstances than using exchange rate targeting. So let me talk a little bit about the first one. Think about a very easy economy, very simple one, where we have, let's say, 3 markets. We have a labor market where real wages are determined. We have a goods market where basically the demand for money is determined. And we have an external, let's say, accounts market, where the real exchange rate is determined. So basically we have the labor market where, very simple, think about this, real wages, which is nominal wages divided by the price level, W divided by P. That's a very simple one. And I'm not going to say very much more complicated things than this. The second one is the real exchange rate. So that's, let's talk about this in very simple terms, the nominal exchange rate divided by the price level, E divided by P. And we have the goods market, where we have a monetary aggregate divided by P. So we have three basically very representative simple economy with three markets. The point is we have here three relative prices to be determined by the economy. Again, the real wage, we have the real exchange rate, and we have the real monetary aggregate, which is M divided by P. We have four nominal variables, E, W, P, and M. So the point is, if we don't want the nominal system, let's say, to inflate, to blow away, we have to use an anchor. And the question is, which anchor should we use? Should we use nominal wages as an anchor? That is the relative price in the labor market? It's not a very good idea. As you know very well, those economies where wages are not market determined, but let's say centrally determined, they usually don't work very well. And basically they reflect more than anything the bargaining power between, let's say, different economic agents. We could think about unions, we could think about entrepreneurs, we could think about the government and so on. It would not be a market determined, it would be, let's say, centrally determined, and that usually does not reflect an efficient outcome. Should it be price controls? P. Everywhere that price controls have been used, as you know very well, gives rise to a lot of trouble. Gives rise to shortages, gives rise to all sorts of problems in terms of providing what is needed in the economy in terms of goods and services. Should we use the nominal exchange rate? That is the nominal exchange rate, which is E divided by P. Sounds like a good idea, perhaps. Has many advantages. You can monitor this very well. The signal, price signal is available to everybody very quickly. You can basically know what the exchange rate, the real exchange rate is almost in real time, because you have the nominal exchange rate published. Basically, you can see it in your financial screen. So that would perhaps be a good idea. And then you have what I think it's a better idea, not to use any of these, but to use inflation expectations as an anchor. Now, in this very simple economy then, we need to determine relative prices. That's what a market economy does. That's what a decentralized market economy, which basically follows price signals, does. It basically determines relative prices. So we have the real wage, we have, I hope inflation goes exactly that way, going down. There you go. So we have the real wage, we have the real exchange rate, and we have the demand for money. Now, why is it better under many circumstances, and from my experience, to use, we have a little echo here. Why is it better to use inflation expectations? Well, using the exchange rate as a nominal anchor leads to a lot of problems. Let me try to concentrate on two, given the experience that many Latin American countries have had. Basically, you have something in the economy you can divide it basically very simply in two. Those goods and services that are commercially, let's say that they are internationally traded, and those that are not internationally traded. How are prices determined in that sector where there are goods and services that are internationally traded? Well, competition takes center stage. And definitely, if you are not producing efficiently, you will certainly be erased by competition. So there is a tremendous market discipline there. On the other side, when we're talking about services, or let's say in general non-tradable goods, there's not this market discipline. And the point is, if there is not this market discipline, how usually are prices determined in that sector? And if we follow, or if we recall very simply, for example, the economic history of Latin America, you will see that usually inflation in the non-tradable goods sector is persistently higher than in the tradable goods sector. But what does that mean? That means that the economy will probably be losing competitiveness in a persistent and systematic way. You will see that the real exchange rate, that is the price of the services in terms of internationally traded goods, rises and rises and rises. That means that the economy is losing competitiveness. It has no important, let's say, price discipline in the non-tradable goods sector. And usually, it focuses on the nominal exchange rate in terms of the most important factor that influences, let's say, price setting. But why should it look at the exchange rate if those goods and services are not commercially or internationally traded? There is no reason for that. And yet, if you go to every single experience in Latin America, you will see that what is most important for price setting in non-tradable goods usually is, for example, the nominal exchange rate. So we have to make a disconnect from price setting in non-tradables from the exchange rate. This is crucial. This is absolutely crucial for an economy to act in an efficient way, for an economy to really try to lose away the persistently higher inflation rate that we see in non-tradables vis-a-vis tradables. Now, if we have this inflation in non-tradables being persistently higher than in tradables, the trouble that we get from there in terms of an overvaluation of the exchange rate, a loss in competitiveness, the price signals in an economy being such that an economy will not efficiently produce. Why? Because you will see that it's more profitable to have an operation, let's say from an entrepreneur point of view, in the non-tradable sector than in the tradable sector. But again, if we look at usually productivity growth in both sectors, you will see that productivity usually is much higher in tradable goods sector than in non-tradables. So we see that the price signals of a real exchange rate that is being overvalued is being distorted and is assigning resources in the economy to that sector which is less productive. So that is precisely what a loss in competitiveness means. So that's a problem. That's a problem, and that's only one of them. Usually when we have a situation in an economy where the real exchange rate is overvalued, and this is basically reflected in an evaluation of the nominal exchange rate, sooner or later, that exchange rate will come under pressure, under stress. And the markets will probably evaluate that there is some misalignment with that nominal exchange rate. And given that the, let's say, economy or the central bank is using the nominal exchange rate as an anchor, it will have to defend against the possible market reaction that believes that that exchange rate is not longer sustainable. So that basically leads usually, for example, in the case of many Latin American countries, that leads to currency crisis. So having a target of the real nominal exchange rate basically means that you have to support that with a huge effort of containing aggregate demand so that inflation in non-tradables will not be higher than in the tradable goods sector. That is, inflation in goods and services which are non-tradable has to come down. And if you're using the exchange rate as an anchor, the only way of this to come down is if you bring down inflation there by bringing down aggregate demand. There are very few economies that can do that efficiently. The savings rates that you need to support let's say, a target for the real exchange rate are very, very large. And usually the only countries that usually or historically have been able to do this are, for example, Asian countries, where if you go to, let's say, the Asian miracle ones or even China, you will see that the savings rates in those economies are 30, 40, in the case of China, even higher than 50% of the economy. That's very difficult to do in Western Hemisphere countries. Very difficult. Not only in Western Hemisphere countries, but also in, let's say, Western countries like Europe and so on. I don't see many emerging markets other than some Asian economies being able to do that. To have that discipline in terms of aggregate demand contention and having huge savings in the economy. If you go to inflation targeting, basically you will not hinder the signals that are giving the economy in terms of the real exchange rate. What you are going to, or what an economy tries to do, is try to anchor everybody through coordinating inflation expectations in a low, stable inflation equilibrium. And basically for that you need certain things in the economy, which I think this country is doing very, very well, especially with a very important fiscal anchor. The program to consolidate the fiscal finances here, the public finances, is, I think, a very important success story. And I think this is precisely what you need. You need a real policy, and these are the public finances. You need real discipline there. And then you need to send the signal that the central bank will, in fact, be acting to contain inflation through anchoring inflation expectations in a coordinated way in the economy by acting credibly and by being able to maintain, that is through time, low, stable inflation. And the way to do that, again, perhaps the most important piece in doing that is precisely to disconnect how prices are determined in non-tradables from the exchange rate, to disconnect the pass-through from exchange rate movements to prices in non-tradable goods and services. So that's let's say the main point that I wanted to make. Of course, given that I only have 15 minutes, there are many aspects to this. I think there are aspects in terms of the coordination of monetary policy and fiscal policy. There are aspects to this in terms of what is the resulting, let's say, welfare from different operating mechanisms of monetary policy. There is the aspect of whether monetary policy can really impact growth or not. There is also issues concerning the best way to implement inflation targeting, but I'm sure that some of these issues will come in the Q&A or in the discussion that we'll have. So the main point again that I sum this up, I end my intervention by saying that inflation targeting has been very successful. It certainly needs fiscal consolidation as a necessary condition, and it permits prices to reflect market forces in precisely the way an economy that tries to assign efficiently its resources in the market is expected to do. So I think that, again, there has been a very important success story with inflation targeting. And I think, again, that the way this country is going, I think, is the correct way. And it has many aspects to that. But I think that, again, the right decisions are being taken. So I'd be delighted to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
It's inflating here. Good? Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you to the Department of Economics and to the Bank of Jamaica for this opportunity to discuss a highly topical issue at this point in Jamaica, which is inflation targeting. Building on the nicely laid out conceptual framework to think about nominal anchor, I will try to provide some context for Jamaica. So, may I please ask you to raise your hand if you believe that inflation is more relevant to you than the exchange rate, and we will flip and ask the question whether exchange rate is more relevant than inflation. Let's start maybe with the former. Who believe that inflation is more for you, not for your neighbor or your grandma, or, for yourself, because then they get conflated. We want the right policy signaling. So let's focus on yourself. If you could please raise your hand if inflation is more relevant to you. Okay, 1/5 of the room. How about exchange rate?
I think that's inflation.
Well, so what about the rest, the 2/3? Is it what's relevant to you? Because 2/3 didn't raise their hand, so. All right, at least we have almost, at least in the population of voters, the turnout was very low, but, I won't went into the danger of democracy under low voter turnout, but, so at least for those who have voted, it's almost half-half. And the next question that I will ask is, what do you expect inflation to be in 2021 in Jamaica? So maybe I will take 3 views. Yes? Him. Not you. It's not IMF, It's the Jamaica thing. So not you, not me. But so 3%. Who else? I heard a 5%. Who else? 5%. Any other volunteer? So we have 2 5%, and we have 1 3%. Let me share with you a chart. This will be part of my argument as to why inflation targeting is right for Jamaica at this point. As you can see, even 3 years out, people believe that inflation will be 5%, which is just the middle range of the target of the Bank of Jamaica. And this chart shows you a broader view of what people expect inflation to be 12 months ahead. And as you can see, this is a survey, just what I just did, but in a wider sample, and showing that inflation expectations in Jamaica are becoming better anchored. And that's one of the key foundations of inflation targeting. Usually it's harder to adopt inflation targeting when inflation is very high, because inflation expectations also tend to be high. So the fact that Jamaica is now in a low inflation environment, there is an opportunity to lock in a durable way, a low inflation environment for Jamaica. And I will explain a little bit why. So maybe just to contextualize a bit, why do we even need an anchor in monetary policy? Why do you want to discipline monetary policy with an anchor? Why don't just let the Bank of Jamaica decide what's best for Jamaica from time to time, looking at conditions? Given that there are a lot of students in the audience, I will use a parallel that a vice president of the Fed once used, Alan Blinder. Maybe Andre didn't tell you, but he doesn't like to grade exams. It's a typical for lecturers, you know. It's very, you want to grade 2-3 papers, not 100. He has 300 students. It's not very funny. And at the same time, Andre certainly wants you guys to study hard. But that's the point. I mean, the point of doing the exam is to incentivize you to study hard, right? But once you've studied hard, what is Andre's optimal decision? It would be to cancel the exam, right? So that he doesn't have to grade, because you've already studied. So why need an exam? So as you can see, there is some kind of time inconsistency if you leave it at the discretion of the professor to decide whether to do an exam or not. Because what will happen is that students will read through that incentive and will not study. Of course, I mean, if they read through the incentive of professor not to grade exams, they will not study. And everybody, it's a suboptimal equilibrium. The way you break that, the way universities have broken that, is to have exam as a compulsory. Exams should be compulsory, and as a professor, you have to actually do the exam. You don't have the discretion to choose or not. The reason why I'm making that parallel is to, I will now transpose it to the inflation targeting to the reason why you need an anchor. So if you, the reason why you need an anchor is that politically it's very attractive to use inflation to inflate the economy, because there is, you can lose a monetary condition to get demand up as a surprise. Because if you surprise people with inflation, real wages will be higher, real wage will be lower. So if you enter a bargaining, or the government or unions enter some bargaining, if inflation, there is a surprise inflation, real wage will go down, firm will hire more, and the economy will expand. So it's politically interesting to inflate the economy in the short term. But then if economic agents read through that incentive, just as students did, inflation will actually go up, and nothing will happen. Your economy will not expand. You just inflate without getting the premium that you expected with the surprise inflation. So there is a merit to have an anchor that is clearly codified and which guide the central bank policy, and that the central bank is accountable to that. Because if you leave it at the discretion of the central bank, there might be that incentive to use inflation surprise, either because in the case of a central bank which is not independent, it could be at the eve of elections, right? You just inflate the economy because you have a lot of money flowing, and you will expect that the economy will grow. And so to avoid that, you need a clearly defined anchor. Now, just to illustrate why, you know, there are many anchors, not just inflation expectations as an anchor. You could choose, as it was, you know, very well explained, monetary aggregate to target the amount of money in circulation. That could be your target. You just say, okay, it shouldn't grow by more than 2%. That's how much the bank put in the system. You can also decide it's about inflation targeting 4 to 6%. That's an anchor. You could also decide to use the exchange rate as your anchor. In the case of Jamaica, I will focus on the latter, the two last ones. Why, for instance, in the case of Jamaica, using exchange rate as the anchor is not necessarily the right choice? I can think of two key reasons. One reason is that actually what you're doing when you fix your, let's take the extreme of fixing the exchange rate, right? I mean, you have from fixing to floating, there is a wide spectrum. But for the sake of argument, let's take the case of a fixed exchange rate. When you fix the exchange rate, what it means is that you're constantly defending the value of the currency, because as it was just discussed, you live in an open economy. It's a small open economy, and you cannot fix those prices. So if you want to fix the exchange rate, which is a price, you have to defend it. And how you do defend it is that you need some healthy amount of reserves to be able to pump in order to defend the currency, because there's supply and demand, right? If you have more reserves, obviously, if there are more people wanting reserve than the available, the exchange rate will depreciate. If you want to defend that, you will be tempted to sell more reserve to prevent that from happening. And this chart shows you that while the level of reserve of Jamaica is very healthy today, more than 3 billion, as you can see from the first part of the chart, the reserve in Jamaica went from some $2 billion US to less than $1 billion in a year. So we're talking about from January 2012 to January 2013, reserve went from 2 billion to 1 billion. I'm making that point, I'm not arguing about the source of the decline, but I'm just making that point to say that the stock of reserve, although healthy, if it's used to manage heavily the exchange rate, it may not last long. And when Jamaica is hit by a shock, when those reserves are really needed, they may not be available to do the job. So managing the exchange rate is a costly business, because what it means is that you're constantly on the market to pump reserve to prevent the currency from being at its equilibrium or market value. That's at least one reason. The second reason is really that think about foreign goods, and there are constantly shocks. Oil price, think about oil price. Oil price going up to, let's say, 150 today. What happened in those circumstances is that the demand for foreign exchange will increase because people need more foreign exchange to actually transact. One way to deal with it is that if your exchange rate is allowed to fluctuate, your exchange rate will depreciate because there is a lot of demand for Forex, FX, to buy those more expensive goods. And as this happens, you may have people driving less or doing more energy conservation. So you have some sort of demand compression. And that's one way of the economy. The economy will go through that shock by using the exchange rate. So the exchange rate will be what it's called an economic shock absorber. So you want your exchange rate to fluctuate because that's a policy lever, because your exchange rate allows you to cushion those external shocks for which you have over which you have very little control. So shock absorber, think of your exchange rate as allows you to absorb external shock. So immediately you can see that when you fix or you manage heavily your exchange rate, you're losing a precious policy lever. Because essentially, you will be focused on defending the exchange rate. And obviously, if you're defending your exchange rate, you cannot focus on stimulating the demand. Because what happens is that if the demand is weak, let's say the underlying demand in the economy is weak and you want the economy to grow, what should we be doing? Cutting interest rate, right? But if you are in a heavily managed exchange rate, when you cut interest rate, what happens? People find it more profitable to invest abroad. So if people find it more interesting to invest abroad, your exchange rate will depreciate because they will want to. And if you over concern by that, you will not cut the interest rate. So your economy will remain weak because you're over focused on protecting the exchange rate at the expense of local domestic conditions, which should be stimulated using interest rate cut. Another element very essential in the case of Jamaica is that when you overburden your monetary policy and you lose that policy lever, Jamaica has a debt to GDP ratio of 100%. So there is very little fiscal space. So you cannot count on the central government to use fiscal policy to stimulate the economy when it's needed. So if you have outsourced your monetary policy because you are encumbered by exchange rate concern and your debt is very high, there is no way out. There is very little way out. So because debt level is very high in Jamaica, it puts a premium on letting the exchange rate be flexible so that you can use monetary policy to stimulate the demand in the short term if needed, because you're not concerned by what a cut in interest rate will mean for your exchange rate. So, you know, the policy lever, maintaining that policy lever, it's critical in policy making. The only reason why you need a clear anchor, and in this case, inflation as a nominal anchor, is that it's easier to make the central bank accountable, because the target will be defined by the government based on what are the, the outlook for the economy, and the central bank will be committed to that inflation target. And it's clear, because, you know, I didn't ask why many people expected 5%. Maybe it's because it's a target. And yeah, and if they believe that the bank will deliver, if it's 5.5 or 6.7, they're going to say, what happened, right? They're going to be asking the central bank, what happened? And obviously, for the central bank to be able to deliver on that mandate, on that inflation, it needs some room. It needs some operational autonomy. It shouldn't be something that is changing overnight. It should have the space to adjust its interest rate, which is its policy tool on the inflation targeting, in order to stimulate demand as needed. Because there is such thing called transmission channel. It takes a little bit of time from the time the central bank cut its policy rate to when firm or household actually borrow at the bank. So it takes a little bit of time for that to filter through. So you need to leave the central bank, give central bank some breathing room to be able to actually effectively deliver on its mandate. And that's the context under which the government has tabled in Parliament a bill to amend the Bank of Jamaica Act to do a few things. Number one is to make sure that the central bank has the breathing space to conduct monetary policy. Number two, that the central bank has the financial resources to conduct its mandate. Because I won't get into the technicality, but it's costly for the central bank to conduct some of those monetary policy operations. And importantly also, to make the central bank accountable, but because it will be very clear what the accountability framework is. If you're targeting some, if you're managing the exchange rate, which level are you going to target? That's giving a lot of discretion to the central bank, right? Because who knows what's the appropriate level? It's very unclear. Unless it's the pure fixed exchange rate, if it's the managed currency, it's not clear what is the level of exchange rate. You cannot say why. Why is it one, I don't know. Instead of, there is no clear number that need to be targeted. But in case of inflation targeting, it's actually give a lot of power to the public to hold the government or the central bank accountable to its mandate, which is inflation targeting. Now, there have been a lot of changes in monetary policy operation in Jamaica. I must actually hasten to say that when you look at how inflation has moved in Jamaica, the red line shows you the inflation rate in Jamaica. So inflation targeting is no new business per se for the bank, although there was a mix of inflation and some sort of management of the exchange rate in the past. But you will see from this chart that inflation has come down dramatically, and some have characterized what the Central Bank of Jamaica has been doing as inflation targeting light. But obviously, this was done under a BOJ, Bank of Jamaica Act, which was still conflated with many objectives, which up to now do not necessarily support inflation targeting, because in there you have exchange rate, you have the economic growth, you have all sort of inflation and other sort of considerations. But in practice, the bank has been behaving for quite a number of years as an inflation targeter, but then the legislation and the legal infrastructure wasn't supportive of that framework. So the move now is to codify that practice to make sure that it's not idiosyncratic. It doesn't depend on who is the governor of the central bank or who is the minister of finance, but that is really something that can be durably and apply across the board. Now, this is what has happened in Jamaica over the past 1 year and a half now, since the introduction of what the central bank has called B-Fixit. So the red line shows you the exchange rate. What do you notice from that chart? I want one of the youngsters there. What do you notice from this chart? Well, I'm told that I have 1 minute. So what you notice from this chart is that, well, if you can't see from, just trust me, right? It's you have an exchange rate that was moving one way, going north, but since the introduction of B-fixes, you kind of see a two-way movement in the exchange rate. Why is this important? Let me give you, maybe try to break it down a little bit. The reason why it's important to have a two-way movement in the currency is that you kind of offset some of the arbitrage. Let's say you're trying to figure out by how much you're going to increase your price. If you know the trajectory of the exchange rate, it's very easy. You just mark it up by whatever you expect the exchange rate to be. But if the exchange rate is going two-way, you're tempted to just let your price, you can't bet on it going up. And if you increase your price and exchange rate appreciate, you eventually have to bring them down or you lose your market share. So it has actually been shown that what is called the pass-through from exchange rate depreciation to inflation is very low under inflation targeting. And you know why? Because inflation expectations are well anchored, and people expect inflation to be 5%, and the behavior in the economy is such that inflation ends up being 5%. You can think about wage contracts, how wage contracts are designed. If both parties expect the inflation to be 5%, you will end up having a contract that gravitates around that number. And eventually, if wages go up by 5%, purchasing power go up by much, so you will have a sort of anchor in the price level in the economy. So this chart, the shorter bar is under inflation targeting. This is the pass-through. When exchange rate goes up by 1%, by how much does inflation go up? It's very low under inflation targeting. So inflation targeting, under inflation targeting, the pass-through of exchange rate depreciation, which is one of the worries to start with, under this regime, you actually have a lower pass-through of exchange rate to inflation. Obviously, there are some considerations that have improved the functioning of the inflation targeting regime. Things as improving the transmission channel of monetary policy, making sure that when the central bank cut the interest rate, it actually filtered through the system, and the actual borrowing costs and lending costs reflect to some extent, in some significant magnitude, and within a very relatively short time span, the actions of the central bank. So just maybe to end, there is one aspect of inflation targeting that is not often emphasized enough, is inflation targeting is actually one element of financial inclusion, right? Because think about a saver, and you're saving for your retirement, let's say. Inflation is a tax on you. Because if you're on fixed income and inflation keeps going up, your retirement, when you want to use those funds, it's very little value. There is very little that you can buy with that. So inflation targeting is actually part of the whole financial deepening aspect of policy. So I will leave it here. Yeah, thank you.
Oh. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for coming to our first discussion forum. I normally invite Constant to my classes to deliver his lecture on inflation targeting. Now today, I'm going to take it from a very simple point of view, the layman's point of view, and I'm going to play a devil's advocate with my previous presenter colleagues, and just to give you an idea of where we are going. Now, the topic inflation rate versus exchange rate targeting, it is important that we target stable prices, but at what cost? At what cost? Now, sometimes when you look at macroeconomic policy, can you hear me in the green shirt? Good. So as long as he can hear me, then we cover the entire spectrum of the room. Now, when you look at macroeconomic policy, and you look at the host of policy, fiscal government and to the central bank, then it's quite sensible, therefore, if the central bank can't achieve all its objectives, to really focus on one objective, which is really to keep prices stable. But research has shown, and to put things into context, we have to really look at Jamaica and where it is. And we operate what we call a small open economy. And basically, as a small open economy, we have certain characteristics that are very different from a large economy, which is, one, we are a price taker. So the price of international goods and services are determined outside of our control, as well as we have to work with the global interest rates. With this said, research has shown that a fully floating exchange rate might not be as glorious as we might want it to be. So a colleague, Gita Gopinath, in 2017 did some research, and his research found that given that the overall exports or the imports of developing countries or smaller SIDS face international prices and they're indexed in foreign currency, then if it is the case that you are importing one-way tradables referring to goods that you only can purchase, you cannot supply to the rest of the world. For example, oil is a one-way tradable. Other equipment and machinery are also one-way tradables for many developing countries. And a lot of our consumer items that we do not produce locally are also one-way tradables. So with this in mind, I did what we call a line graph of our exports and imports over the last 3 years using monthly data. So if you take a look at the, it's not moving, Christine, that now move. All right. So we're looking better now. So what we've done here is to plot our exports, our imports, and the exchange rate, and we ran some trend lines through them. Now the two top lines, the exchange rate is on the right axis, while the imports and exports on the left axis. But the middle line is the exchange rate line. And if you notice, if you look at 2017 and beyond, whenever, for example, and I need the clicker, whenever exchange rate is falling, exports, the red line above it, is also falling. Whenever exchange rate is increasing, not exports, imports, sorry, the red line above it, whenever exchange rate is increasing, and this is a nominal, imports is also increasing. Whenever exchange rate begins to decrease once more, imports decrease once more. When the exchange rate shoots up, imports shoots up, and you kind of see a particular trend being displayed by both the imports and the exchange rate. So if you look here, when the exchange rate is falling here, imports is also falling here. When the exchange rate goes up, imports going up. When the exchange rate is coming down, imports is always coming down. When the exchange rate shoots up, imports also shoots up. I know this is the nominal, and central bank normally works with the real, so this is irrelevant, but at the same time, it speaks a lot for trade and commerce. So I run a trend line through the exchange rate, another trend line through imports, and as you can see, both of them display some sort of increase in trend. Now, if you look at, for example, a simple correlation coefficient between the two, it's 0.66, and we also did some Granger type co-integration tests, and both exchange rate, the nominal, when difference for unit root, as well as the imports when difference displays some amount of co-integration over time. Also look at the level of exports, and as you can realize, exports also show some amount of improvement, which is what we have been working towards, because the aim is depreciate the currency so that we can export more. But the volume of exports has not been responding as the volume of imports. I realize imports is very more responsive. And what we're seeing here is that because we are importing a lot of one-way tradables, goods that Jamaica does not produce, then the exchange rate here, the nominal, is really the rate that the people are seeing. For example, my colleague here who owns spaces, she imports furniture and so on. Not that we're promoting importation of furniture, we want boss to make everything, but boss really can't make everything. So we really have to look at where we're headed and then where we're going, you know. So this shows us a sort of picture of what is really taking place in our imports buying market. I also move forward to look at the net exports. So this is the exchange rate and this is net exports. So as you can realize, as the exchange rate increases, nominal that is, the net exports tends to fall. But this is not what we really want to see. We want to see net exports going in this direction whenever. So I'm wondering if it is the case that the exchange rate should fall, considering over, have a trend line that's falling, will net exports revert and increase? So that opens room for more research for the young budding economic students who are here tonight. I also look at the exchange rate and oil prices. So the exchange rate is here. This is the Brent. This is the crude. This is over the last 3 years. I have more data spanning back all the way to 2000, but I just decided to use the last 3 years just to narrow down the picture for us. So you realize some amount of, and then you have the correlation 0.58, 0.59. Now, these are the different domestic oil or derivative prices in Jamaica. This is the exchange rate just the same. You realize that they are moving together, no correlation analysis done, but just to give you a picture of the types of goods that we import and the prices that people face as it relates to energy costs, which is an important cost if we determine to manufacture goods and services. So here I'm matching them up against the exchange rate, and then here I'm matching them up against global oil prices, which is this. So the picture is clear. There's some amount of relevance of the nominal exchange rate in our purchasing decisions as a country. It has implications for our imports. It has marginal implications for the exports, but it really plays a role in our ability to really purchase tradables versus one-way tradables versus non-tradables. Now, if we want to look at our national debt, very important as well, you'll see here for Jamaica's external debt portfolio increased by over 7 billion or 6% from the end of March 2018 to December 2018. That's over a 3-quarter period, 3 quarters, not 3 quarters. So that's a 9-month period. It increased by 7.1 billion. And the government's fiscal policy paper, you can check the Ministry of Finance and you can go through the fiscal policy paper. It's there for everyone to research. Attributes this to a depreciation in the Jamaican dollar relative to the US. So not only are our exports, our imports more expensive, and not only is our net exports falling, but we realize that our foreign debt servicing is also increasing as a result of a depreciating currency. The central government external debt is projected to increase from 1.192 billion to 1.211 billion at the end of March. And this is also in the fiscal policy paper, nothing derived from Dr. Haughton. This is the proportion of debt. So 61% is central government external debt, 39% central government domestic debt. And what we're seeing is that if we were to track this over a period of time, we're seeing that we're increasing or has remained constant the external debt portfolio, which means that a significant amount of our portfolio is denominated in this external debt currency, and it might have implications for us going forward. If anyone was thinking about the difference between what is happening now and the debt to GDP ratio, I mean, our total debt is like 1.94 trillion. 2 years ago, it was 2.14 trillion. So we've lost some amount of billions, but not as significant from the stock. Now, in this case, in my book, Developing Sustainable Balance of Payments in Small Countries, in Chapter 2, we do some sort of debt sustainability analysis, and the results there also indicated that there's a negative relationship between the debt and the exchange rate. So whenever we have depreciations, the debt increases, and so on and so forth. Now, this brings us to monetary policy. And in a sense, if we're looking at the standard Taylor rule and how monetary policy is supposed to be administered in countries who try to target inflation using the exchange rate, then the nominal interest rate here should respond to, 1, the inflation rate, 2, some amount of the natural rate of interest, as well as any deviation of inflation from its target, as well as any deviation of output from its long-run range. Now, in this case, if we were supposed to target inflation properly, then our DSGE model should be able to properly predict the natural rate of interest. It should be also be able to properly predict the long-run value of output. Now, in this case, the inflation here, pi star, represents the targeted level, and any deviation of real inflation from the targeted level should be represented in the nominal interest rate that is set by the central government. In this case, the DSGE model that we use as a central bank must be robust enough to accurately predict, 1, the nominal rate of interest, and 2, not the nominal, sorry, the natural rate of interest, and 2, the output level Y bar. Now, in this case, when I check the data and look at the research, because of the change in our interest rate regime from, say, 2013 until now, you realize that it's going to be very difficult for us to predict this long-run rate of interest, as well as if we're looking at the long-run rate of output, it will take some amount of work from us. Also important are our response parameters. In the United States, based on the Taylor rule, these response parameters are 0.5 and 0.5, and it shows how the real or how the nominal interest rate, based on this equation, responds to deviations of inflation from target and deviations of output from its long-run level. In this case, what we want to see here in the United States is 0.5, and this is 0.5, but what is it for Jamaica? So we would have to determine how responsive over time is the nominal interest rate to deviations of inflation from its natural level, so that if it is the case, we can adjust this accordingly to maintain whatever target we set. Also, we would also like to see what is the response level here at this theta y of output from deviations to output to changes in the nominal interest rates. And these are important if it is the case that we wish to properly target inflation. Now, in this case, there are some issues that we have to attest with when we try to target inflation in small island developing states. Inadequate capacity to predict time inconsistencies, inadequate capacity to estimate the natural rate of output or the natural rate of interest, inability to accurately predict the lag effect of monetary policy instrument. The BOJ must have the capacity to accurately predict the length of time between the day of the announcements and the time the actual forecast comes into effect. The BOJ, for example, outlined a medium-term target to be achieved over a 1 year or 2 year period, but publicly justified deviations from the target shows some sort of inconsistencies in the overall approach to monetary policy. This too is counterintuitive. Other issues, if it is the case that the central bank has a particular target and the materialization of inflation, for example, we have a target of 4% and inflation is now 2% or 3%, then if this continues over time, then to some extent the central bank might lose some amount of credibility. Michigan 2001 explains that the central bank can lose credibility by attempting to predict the inflation rate but failing to achieve the target at the appointed time. An increase in the price prediction inaccuracy reduces the manufacturers or the service providers' ability to predict input prices. This leads to indecisiveness, friction in our purchasing patterns, and so on and so forth, which might have additional implication on how output outturns and so on and so forth. The inflation target might correspond to extreme exchange rate flexibility that might cause financial instability and lead to further output volatility. So when you looked at constant graph, for example, and you realize there is more increases and decreases in the overall movement of the nominal exchange rate, then that might in turn contribute to some amount of volatility in the exchange rate market that might lead to buyer or purchaser inability to foresee or predict the import prices. Now, the net interest rate differential also plays a role. Central bank must also have a thorough understanding of the net interest rate differential between them and other trading partners. If the US federal funds rate, for example, increases to attract capital, and the Jamaica overnight treasury bill rate reduces and it detracts capital, then that has implication for the movement of international funds between countries, given that we're a small open economy and we're considered a price taker. Also, if the country is characterized by a weak monetary transmission mechanism with lagged incomplete responses from the lending rate or from the deposit rate, then that also might have an implication for the effectiveness of the inflation target that we're trying to administer. Now, so that whatever we try to do, inflation targeting, or if we are coupling this with some amount of exchange rate interventions, then it must be done cognizant of the international financial atmosphere. Monetary policy's ability to respond to shocks. A major criticism of inflation targeting is that it reduces the central bank's ability to respond and accommodate shocks. Now, we argue this from two sides because the inflation targeters argue that it increases it. We argue that because it reduces their ability to target other shock absorbers, for example, interest rate, exchange rate to some extent, then it might have an impact on their ability. Lack of central bank flexibility and an inability to complement fiscal policy to stimulate the economy are also other challenges. Thank you so much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I'd like to thank Dr. Christine Clark for chairing this evening's proceedings and the Department of Okay, not to worry, there are no more line graphs coming up right now for my presentation. Can rest. But thank you for having me here this evening. So you've heard the technical reasons for the government's policy and the pros and the cons of inflation and exchange rate targeting as a means of managing the economy. Now, I'm no economist, I'm a woman who 10 years ago had an idea to start a business. And my business is that of creating beautiful homes across Jamaica. So tonight, I'm just going to try and give my layman explanation for why I do what I do. My role this evening is simply to highlight how in actuality, a fluctuating exchange rate affects my business model and ultimately how that affects pricing for the consumer. In an ideal world, Jamaica would be able to produce all the goods we require: clothing, food, building materials, etc. But not even in developed countries can we operate in a vacuum. And inputs from across the globe are required to satisfy the needs of the population. Jamaica is no different. And currency exchange risk is something that all business must manage. As a business owner, you're accustomed to the Jamaican dollar devaluing. That is not news. I can recall when I first started business some 10 years ago that the exchange rate was roughly around 70 to 1. At the peak in 2018, the dollar was trading close to 140 to 1. With all other factors remaining constant, that is a 100% increase in the price of an item in 10 years. Now, I know my salary hasn't moved the same way, and if yours has, I'd like to have a word with you after this. So in recent times, however, the exchange rate has been particularly unstable. Since January 1st to its peak on February 4th of this year, the J dollar devalued by some 7%. In this case, a 7% depreciation in the dollar against the US increases the input cost of my goods by 7%, while revenues stay the same. For a business with tight margins, this could easily make the difference between making a profit and making a loss. This instability increases my risk exposure, which in turn can affect my business revenue, costs, cash flow, and eventually profits. As a business owner, daily I contemplate decisions that affect customers, business profitability, and employees of the company. For my customers, I have to create a pricing strategy that lends to better pricing for them. A fluctuating currency rate creates challenges for pricing and therefore makes it more difficult to offer goods that are competitively priced, that are affordable, and attainable by my target market. We all know better prices equal happy customers. So customers will most certainly not be happy about price increase, and as such, may make my product uncompetitive. If I get it wrong, I could end up losing them. If that happens, the revenue doesn't increase, and my margins are not enough to sustain operating costs. Operating costs, administrative costs, how do I forecast and hire more employees? They're faced with the same challenges with their dollar getting them more, their salaries getting them less. I would like to pay them more, but if I can't forecast efficiently and if my revenues stay constant with my input costs going up, then I have a challenge. Let's take, for example, I'll walk you through the process of importation. My colleague said I don't necessarily make anything in Jamaica, but that's not true. I'll forgive him for that. We do import, we do manufacture locally. We'd love to do more of that, but there are still some input products go into the products that we produce locally anyway. So how does my typical pricing work? And how does a fluctuating rate affect my ability to effectively manage pricing? So I purchase goods overseas at say 100 US to 1. Then I have to insure them, ship them to Jamaica, which is all in US dollars. When I get here, the collector of customs says, okay, this is your value, your cost, your insurance, and your freight at 100 to 1. I'm going to charge you duty on that value at 100 to 1. I then pay GCT on that goods at 100 to 1. Now, when it gets to the store, how do I price this? Do I price at 100 to 1 because that's what I paid for it? That's what the consumer is expecting. Or do I price anticipating, speculating what the price of the dollar will be when I go to restock, given a buying cycle a month from now. Some products it could be 2 weeks, some it's a month, some it's 3 months. How do I account for that factor in fluctuation? And how do I strike the balance in pricing today for what the consumer can afford today versus what I would like to, what I'm going to have to pay for it when I am restocking? These are the challenges and the questions that I'm faced with all the time. Then the consumer says to me, okay, well, the dollar goes down. Your price should go down too. How comes I'm not benefiting? I said, I'd love to benefit. I would love to pass on the benefit to you. But I've already purchased this good at 100 to 1. And today you're seeing the exchange rate at 90. Where is the real savings for you? Well, I would love to give you, and I try my very best to. But these are the questions that I'm posed with. I have an obligation to my staff. I have an obligation to my community. I'd like to be one of those nation builders who eventually grow to the level where I'm employing persons throughout Jamaica. Right now, we're only based in Kingston. So these are the challenges that I face. And while I understand that in a free market, there are fundamental laws of economics, such as demand and supply, that will invariably affect the movement of currency. There is seasonal increases. I, for one, am guilty of that. I restock a particular time of the year and I have a greater demand for US dollars. I understand those concepts, but it's the inability to predict, it's the fluctuations that happen within a month. Take, for example, earlier this year, that limits my ability to effectively price, which in turn affects, ultimately, my margins and at the end of the year, the profits. So with that, I only hope that this evening I was able to shed some light on how as a business I try to manage currency exchange volatility and fluctuations as a part of risk management. Thank you.
Okay, please give our speakers another round of applause. And I want to just pause also to acknowledge the presence of Jamaica's ambassador from Mexico, His Excellency Juan Jose Gonzalez Mijares, as well as our Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, Professor David Tennant, and also the Senior Deputy Governor, John Robinson, who joined us. Did you want to make a comment? Okay, so I'm going to allow the panelists, if they have comments, to each other first, and then there's a mic in the center here. Hopefully we can take a couple rounds of questions once those responses have been given. Okay. Is it on?
There you go. Okay. Yeah. Let me address some of the topics that were mentioned in the presentations. Perhaps, and this is very important in how usually a central bank communicates. It really has to make a tremendous effort in communicating, as somebody recently or just said, with the layman, with its citizens. The explanations should be as less technical as possible. Perhaps, even though I tried that to be at the beginning, perhaps I was not, let's say, my explanation perhaps was not simple enough. Let me try to do that now with some of the elements that I just heard from the rest of the presenters. I think that, first of all, the discussion concerning whether the economy should be managed macroeconomically, either under inflation targeting or with exchange rate targeting, should be well dimensioned. What is that discussion? it seems to me that the discussion seems to be, and this is not only here, but also in countries that have had this discussion, whether at the end of the day what we are understanding is how can I grow by more, how can I consume more, how will my well-being be affected by either one way of doing things or another way of doing things. And I don't know whether that is truly the gist of what a society discusses or debates when, for example, choosing a monetary policy scheme. I think there is an even more important point which has to do with viability. And more than anything, I think that the discussion or the question should be what can, given the characteristics, a certain country do concerning management of its economy in macroeconomic terms that will lead to the best possible outcomes. But not only in terms of, let's say, an optimal policy, but in terms of a viable policy. So let me try to put in very, very simple terms what I think is some of the most important issue in this discussion here from what I see. Usually, a government, and this is not only, I don't know whether that's the case here in Jamaica, but usually it associates a strong currency with a strong government. That's what usually happens. You can have this type of discussion, for example, in an advanced economy, and that's even there, one would have to be very careful whether that is really the case or not. Usually politicians, and I'm not talking about here about Jamaica, but I'm talking about anywhere. Usually they tell everybody, well, look at the exchange rate, and that will tell you whether I'm doing things well or not. And a strong currency, again, signals strong government, strong policies. Why? Well, I think that most important is because people feel very good that if there is a strong currency, they can buy a lot of things that are not, for example, produced, let's say gadgets, like iPhones, like iPads, like televisions, and so on. And they say, well, I feel good. Strong currency means that I have a lot of purchasing power in many goods and services that I, let's say, consume. So that's excellent because it does reflect that. If I have a strong currency, I will be able to buy more iPads, more iPhones, more anything in terms of, let's say, of a foreign currency of dollars. So that's fantastic. And that's why politicians say, well, I'm doing things well. The point is whether that's viable and whether monetary policy can support that or not. That's the point. And think about what I was commenting a little while ago, which is usually if you look at the way prices are set in the economy, inflation of services or of goods in the non-tradable, let's say, sector, usually is higher than in the tradable goods sector, especially if you have, let's say, a fixed or a crawling peg or a relatively stable exchange rate. So what does that mean through time? Through time, this means that precisely because inflation is higher in non-tradables than tradables, there will be a loss in competitiveness. And the only way to increase competitiveness will be through a higher nominal exchange rate. But you can't do that because you're fixing it. Because if I do that, weak government, weak politicians, weak policies. So you're in a bind. Everybody feels good that they can buy a lot of things, but that wellness, let's say, is being reflected in a loss on competitiveness. Why? Exactly because what is being charged in the non-tradable goods services sector is higher than in the tradable goods services sector. And the only way to gain competitiveness is by doing something that you can't do, which is move the exchange rate. So what happens? what happens is, given that the central bank is, let's say, targeting a nominal exchange rate, it cannot move it. So given that it has to defend the exchange rate, this loss in competitiveness, basically what is leading to is a loss of reserves. The central bank cannot permit the nominal exchange rate to adjust to regain competitiveness. And not only doesn't it do that, but it defends the pegged or the crawling peg or the fixed exchange rate. So that is basically leading to a loss in reserves. So what is the central bank doing, or the government's policies doing? They are subsidizing too high a consumption through loss of reserves. That's it. And that's terrible. Everybody feels good if they can consume more in terms of, tradable goods, as I say, gadgets and imported goods and whatever. But the point is, what is at the end of the day financing that relatively or artificially high consumption pattern is a loss in reserves. There's a cost to that. And the question is the central bank's role to finance that artificially high consumption? And let me be very, very frank with you. That is not the role of monetary policy. The only way that you will be able to feel that you are really being able to consume what you want and feel good about that is through the productivity gains. And it's not through maintaining an artificially low or artificially overvalued exchange rate. At the end of the day, what happens? And you can go to any experience in any country. The central bank is defending because it wants to maintain an artificially relatively high rate of consumption in tradable goods, in gadgets, and so on. But at the end of the day, it will come a time when it runs out of reserves. And when it runs out of reserves, the economy has to adjust. And the economy will adjust by having a very important, abrupt, and intense devaluation. So whatever it was trying to do, maintain an artificially high consumption in tradable goods, it will be a failure. And it will get precisely the opposite, because the economy has to adjust and it cannot import as much as it is, and it cannot support a relatively or artificially high rate of consumption in terms of tradable goods. So the exchange rate will increase, it will depreciate, there will be a currency crisis, and that will pass on to inflation. So it's not viable. Of course, when I try to gauge here and everybody and in other countries, what is better? Of course, people are going to be tending to select, no, I'd rather have exchange rate targeting than inflation targeting. There's a fear of floating. Will I have excessive volatility? Will there be too much risk in the sense of how the exchange rate behaves so that I will not be able to do an efficient price setting? But I don't think that's the real deep question. The real deep question is, should monetary policy be subsidizing artificially high consumption in tradables? That's the point. And that funding comes through the loss of reserves. And should monetary policy be doing that? Monetary policy should not be doing that. Monetary policy should take care of a low, stable inflation for everybody, not to maintain an artificially high rate of consumption in tradable goods. And this is crucial because I think that the discussion should be set in those terms. What can monetary policy do? Can monetary policy, should it be directed at having an artificially rate of consumption in tradable goods, in gadgets and so on, so that people feel good? Well, I feel good also with my iPhone and with my iPad and whatever. Everybody feels fantastic. The point is whether the central bank should be doing that, or whether there should be other policies geared at increasing productivity and at relatively high purchasing power by its citizens. And the only way to maintain a high sustainable purchasing power by the citizens in a sustainable way is, again, through productivity gains. And I don't know what many of you think about, but I don't think monetary policy is the right tool to increase productivity. It's a necessary condition to have a stable macroeconomic environment. But to increase productivity, you go to real policies, not monetary policies. You go to education, you go to training, you go to try to address the skills mismatch between high technology and the average capacity of workers in a certain place given the advance in technological or the technological progress. So that is the point. You have to ask yourselves, what do you want? If you want to consume in a sustainable way more, let's say, or through time, more imported goods, do you want to use monetary policy for that? It won't happen. It will not happen. You need to increase your productivity, and that is not macroeconomic policy. Let me go to the second one. So basically, at the end of the day, you have to basically attenuate the increase in, let's say, imports. An increase in imports to unsustainable levels basically is reflecting unsustainable aggregate demand expansion. The current account, the external accounts of an economy, what they reflect is the excess of expenditures over the revenues that it produces. That's the current account by definition. So if you're importing too much, let's say, by consuming too many tradable goods through exchange rate targeting, at the end of the day, you are financing that through a loss of reserves. And if you want to close that gap after you lose that reserves, you will have to devaluate. And again, that devaluation will hinder the artificial expansion in consumption of tradable goods. The economy will have to adjust at the end of the day. And that policy that finance an artificially high rate of consumption is non-viable. So, of course, when you put it basically as societies understand this debate is, do I want to consume more or less tradable goods? Well, of course I want to consume more tradable goods. And of course that would lead to a question, I'd rather have inflation, exchange rate targeting. Again, that's not viable, that's not sustainable, and you should look to other policies, not macroeconomic management, but to other micro policies that will lead to higher productivity growth. That's the first topic that I wanted to address. Very quickly, the second topic that I wanted to address is the current debate. This is what some of these things are being debated in terms of some emerging markets, which was, if you have exchange rate targeting, you don't have independence of monetary policy. All of the monetary policy is geared towards targeting the exchange rate. So you don't have monetary policy independence. That's the first thing that one has to understand. You can lose monetary policy independence by two main things. One is through fiscal dominance, which I'm not going to talk about here, and the second is precisely by using exchange rate targeting. Why? Because you're not targeting the price formation, the economy, inflation, you are targeting the exchange rate. And part of the instruments that you use to target under special or under shock conditions are loss of reserves, which we have established that it's not viable. So the point is now, that was the first point. The point now that is being debated in emerging markets is, okay, so you want monetary policy independence, you have inflation targeting, and you have a free float. But under those conditions, remember that something happened in 2009 and 2010, which was a recession, the global financial crisis, an unprecedented degree of monetary accommodation in industrial economies. And with that degree of monetary accommodation, there were huge capital flows to emerging markets. And the question was, what do I do with these capital flows? Because these capital flows are huge with respect to the size of financial markets in EM economies, in emerging market economies, and they certainly pose a lot of risk to monetary policy management. That is the dilemma. That is a problem which is, let's say, in a further stage than the decisions that you're taking now concerning the basic, let's say, operating mechanism of the central bank. And that has to do with, okay, are these capital flows coming in? If I permit the exchange rate to appreciate, I will lose competitiveness, or I will lose precisely competitiveness because the exchange rate is appreciating, and I'm not doing something on the other side of the coin to gain productivity, so that decrease in competitiveness will really hit my economy. But if I don't appreciate, if I have a fixed exchange rate and I let all of the capital flow, let's say, go into the country without appreciating, then I will be importing all of these very lax monetary conditions of industrialized economies in my economy, and man, that will certainly lead to inflation. So that is the new debate, which is at a further stage than what is being discussed by this society now. I would not put too much, let's say, stress on this new debate about whether a central bank in a small open economy like Mexico's or like other EMs can have monetary independence with such huge capital flows. I think that is a further stage of the debate, and I don't think that would be too much relevant here. What is relevant is, once you decide, the society decides on an exchange rate or, an operating mechanism for the central bank, you do have to deal possibly with these huge capital flows, and you have to make the right diagnostics concerning whether these capital flows are responding to changes in fundamentals, or whether they are responding, or whether they can lead to problems in the microstructure of financial markets, which would deem necessary FX intervention. But not to target the exchange rate, but to get rid of excess volatility, not reflecting changes in fundamentals. So that gives me the next point. The next point, this is my next to last, is something that was mentioned, excess volatility. Is there really a fear to float? If you've read and you are familiar, as I've been trying in the last few days to be familiar with the laws that are being discussed in Parliament now, accompanying this inflation targeting is the necessity to develop your financial markets. And if you develop your financial markets, precisely one of the reasons is to deal with exchange rate risk. This is one of the things that, for example, we did in Mexico after we adopted inflation targeting. It is very important, if there is fear in the economy that a free float will be reflecting excess volatility, for the economic agents to be able to hedge against that volatility, so that there will be, let's say, no real issues concerning price formation and what signal to read from an excess volatility. You can buy options, you can buy forwards, you can buy futures, and so on. The point is to make that market deep, and not only in terms of exchange rate, but also in terms of interest rate risk, in terms of exchange rate risk, in terms of liquidity risk, in terms of credit risk, and so on. So this volatility of exchange rates, if you have an open economy, will not only be, let's say, in exchange rate, but also in interest rates and also in other type of risks. So if you develop your financial markets, you will be able to make agents deal with those risks a lot more efficiently. So remember, this inflation targeting is not only a decision on how the central bank operates in the short term. It has to be accompanied by other measures that precisely can make a central bank deal with these risks, so that economic agents will be able to risk share in a much better way, leading to a much better, let's say, economic outcome. And my last point was one really, very quick operating point. Under, of course, inflation targeting, any Taylor rule and so on, of course, there are difficult things to measure, like potential growth, like the natural rate of interest, and so on. But this is not only, this does not mean that you should not be trying to do it. Not only because you are inflation targeting, but because in order to gauge the phase of the business cycle properly and macroeconomic policy management, you have to try to see or to gauge in what phase of the business cycle you are, independently of whether you use inflation targeting or exchange rate targeting. But just as difficult, if you try to target your real exchange rate, what is the real exchange rate equilibrium in an economy, so that you can target it? It's as difficult to obtain as trying to gauge the natural rate of interest in an economy, as trying to gauge potential GDP and so on. This does not mean that you don't have to do it and that there are tools to do it. Imperfect tools, yes, but I do think that reasonably well one can do it, and certainly this leads me to my last point. If you go to other small open economies that have been very successful in macroeconomic policy management, you will not see, in terms of, for example, industrialized economies, I'm thinking about, for example, Australia, I'm thinking about New Zealand, other small open economies, you will not see exchange rate targeters. That leads to a lot of problems. I was talking with the staff of the Bank of Jamaica, and they know all of these very well. I'm not going to go into them, but I do think that in terms of macroeconomic management, for different reasons, not only the ones that I gave you about the viability of certain policies, I do think that inflation targeting is certainly a much better tool to use. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to open the floor. Any questions from the floor? See if we can take a round or two. Please introduce yourself also.
My name is Kevin Williams. I have three questions to Manuel and Kingston. My first question is, why target inflation? Why not targeting nominal GDP? The second question is, why the current range is the most optimal one? Why not somewhere between the range of 7 to, say, 10%, as opposed to the current one? And my third question is, Jamaica, with a debt to GDP ratio of about $2 trillion.
No.
So we have this debt to GDP level on the one hand, and inflation targeting on the other hand. A country in that environment faced with a negative shock, how should the government respond?
Okay, are there any other questions? Can we take a round first? Maybe two more.
All right, good evening, everyone. I am Michaela Gonzalez. So my question, or rather, I'm going to point out that we haven't really explored a part of the discussion today, which is, are two targets better than one? I don't know if it's planned that this side of the table is saying inflation and this side seems to be saying exchange, but I want to know, is it possible for you to target both, seeing that you both have pointed out pros and cons? He's already saying no, but I'd want to know why, just seeing that it's a part of the discussion, and if you do believe that there are ways to incorporate both elements, just to comment on that.
Can we take one more? Is there another question? Would you, please? I think there might only be one round.
Yes, good night, rather. My name is Roger Copeland. Just a quick observation. With what is happening in the global economy now, how could Jamaica, as a small island state, avoid what has happened with states like Venezuela? Okay.
Okay. You want to go ahead?
Since I was, the question, I mean, I guess the first set of questions were addressed to me. The first one is, why not nominal GDP targeting? Because obviously, nominal GDP will embed both growth, real income, which is what we all arguing about, right? You know, the whole thing, the whole purpose is to improve the standard of living of people. I mean, it's not inflation targeting for the sake of inflation targeting. Ultimately, you want deeper financial markets, you want financial inclusion, and you want growth. So it's fair to say that we want to target something that includes that GDP in the first place. And that would also encompass inflation, which, so nominal GDP would encapsulate both standard of living, real standard of living, and the inflation. I can think of at least two challenges in that regard. The very first basic challenge is a challenge of measurement and the lag in those measurements. That's a very easy one. Inflation, typically you have monthly inflation, which is available, in the case of Jamaica, 2 weeks after the end of the month, you have your inflation. So if you're thinking about accountability, you know immediately 2 weeks after the end of the month whether inflation was X or Y, and you know where it is compared to your target. So even in terms of the responsiveness of the central bank, it could be quicker. And already, as I mentioned earlier, you have the transmission lag. So if already you have data lag in terms of how fast those number aggregate that you are targeting are available to you, it's even it even compound to the lag. So the one issue is really that GDP is observable with a much higher lag, longer lag. In the case of Jamaica, I believe it's 3 months after the end of the quarter that they release the real GDP for the quarter, not even for the month. So not only it's lower frequency, so it's not as frequent, it's quarterly, but also the lag is much longer. So it complicates the process of the whole policy design. So it will get longer. It's like you will be trying to catch up all the time. The second point, and I must have acknowledged that many advanced central banks are thinking about those issues. Should we target in the first place, should we target the price level or the change in the price level, which is inflation? And then should we even focus about nominal GDP or just inflation? So the second impediment to that is, to which extent can you really say that, and I think Mr. Ramos touched on it, to which extent the central bank has control over the immediate growth outcome? So targeting nominal GDP, you would say, okay, if growth falls short, then so you could achieve the same level of nominal GDP because of inflation. Will you have been more successful because you have higher inflation and low GDP? You can have the same nominal GDP with a lower equilibrium where you have lower inflation and high real GDP, or high inflation and low real GDP. You will have achieved your target. So the question then is, what are you accountable to, and what is the desirable equilibrium that you want to take the economy to? And also, in all fairness to the central bank, it's very hard to do much in terms of growth in the very short term. Right? You can use monetary policy to navigate the cycle, but if you're thinking about a nominal GDP targeting, and given also the lag that it takes to actually generate higher growth, you're talking about longer horizon target. So that would complicate the question a little bit. Now, on the second point, very important point, why 4 to 6? I believe that's a question to the Ministry of Finance, because how it works is that actually what happened is that, just for the sake of accountability, the central bank is not the one setting the target, the medium-term target. It's set in consultation with the broader government based on where the government see the economy going and based on the outlook. And then once the target is set, you leave some breathing room to the central bank, which you then have to provide him with operational autonomy to deliver on that target. Looking at the history of Jamaica, and if you look at one of the charts that I showed earlier in terms of the type of disinflation that occur in the Jamaican economy, you would probably say that 4 to 6, when you look at where Jamaica, the projected growth rate of Jamaica, that's the type of, range that would be consistent with the medium-term growth. Obviously, it's not just pull out of the hat. You need to see what, in a general equilibrium model, what is the level of inflation that will accommodate the type of growth that you see during the structural condition of the economy. Now, on the impact on the fact that debt to GDP ratio is high and how should Jamaica cushion shocks, I think that's at the heart of the reason, one of the reasons why Jamaica should not be outsourcing its monetary policy, or should not be giving away its monetary policy, because as Mr. Ramos mentioned, targeting exchange rate is actually giving up on monetary policy. It means if your debt, as I said earlier, the fact that Jamaica's debt is very high, actually that alone obviates the debate. Because if Jamaica's debt were much lower, then maybe there is scope to actually debate, because you have fiscal space to respond to shock. Although debt has come down tremendously in Jamaica, debt is still very high, so you don't have that fiscal space. So what you have in the short term to cushion shocks is really your monetary policy. And as you've seen what the central bank has been doing, cutting the interest rate precisely to stimulate demand. So if anything, the fact that debt is high is another reason not to give away your monetary policy, which means you cannot be overburden monetary policy with exchange rate concerns. And since we're discussing debt, and one point was mentioned, Dr. Haughton mentioned the fact that as exchange rate depreciate, debt goes up, which is a nominal, just a mechanical computation. But how do you deal with that? The way you deal with that, and the same medium-term debt management strategy or fiscal policy paper that will have been referred to will also speak to debt management. How do you structurally, how do you edge against that? Is to develop your domestic market, debt market, which is also linked to the type of monetary policy regime that you choose. The way you edge against exchange risk on the debt side is develop your domestic debt market so that you shift away from borrowing external and try to borrow domestically, and that will edge the government against exchange rate movement. Because one way to think about those regimes is to look at it from a general equilibrium standpoint. You cannot isolate one leg of the problem. You cannot fix your exchange rate because you think you are solving the impact on debt, but then you will have the misallocation that Mr. Ramos mentioned in the economy, because you will have a non-tradable that becomes so uncompetitive that you will not be able to grow. And of course, if you don't grow, your debt will be inflated. So the fact that debt to GDP is actually high, it's an argument for adopting a policy regime, monetary policy regime that gives you freedom to actually act to stimulate demand when needed, because you don't have fiscal space to do that.
Yeah, for those of us who are lost to the discussion, the point that Kevin made about having a higher inflation target really corresponds to us having a higher growth target. If you look at the inflation and you look at, for example, key equations, we can look at the Phillips curve that takes output into consideration, then whenever we have higher output, then we tend to have more inflation. So targeting a higher rate of inflation may allow the country to grow more. There is also a sacrifice ratio that if it is the case that we are looking at prices, we're looking at unemployment and output, then what amount of output do we lose by keeping inflation at a fairly low level? And I know the argument about the sacrifice ratio has not come up in Jamaican discussion, but it also plays a role in understanding that if it is the case that we want to maintain low inflation in an environment like this, then we will lose some amount of output gains that we want to achieve. So it's important for us to picture the sacrifice ratio and to realize that the Jamaican economy is a rare economy, because it is one of those economies where we have prices falling, we have unemployment falling, that goes against the overall predictions of the Phillips curve. So we have to start putting things into more context. We can't have our cake and eat it, as one would want to say. So if it is the case that we want to have low inflation, say 4, 2 or whatever percent, then we have to see how much growth is being sacrificed in order for us to maintain that particular price level. That particular price level. I'm not saying it's bad to target the inflation. We have to target a particular low, stable price level. That was the premise upon which I began my presentation. However, given the nature of the small open economy in which we operate, given the nature of our tradable sector, and a lot of the tradables are not two-way tradables. A lot of the tradables are one-way tradables, like oil and capital equipment and so on are indeed one-way tradables. So it does not present a discussion where the real exchange rate can come into play where those are concerned. So there's much research to be done. I hope that the budding economists who are here, students as well as practitioners, have learned a lot and have also gotten a better understanding of where we are as a country and how we fit into the global economic environment. We are interest rate takers, price takers, and the role that the exchange rate is playing as it relates to our imports, exports, net exports, as well as our investment climate, so that this opens room for more research going forward.
Was there any response to the question about targeting both? Specifically, that question was asked.
Yeah.
Just as direct response?
Yeah, I'll respond and then I'll allow the practitioners to respond. Monetary policy is a useful tool. I mean, when I teach macroeconomics, I teach monetary policy first as a balance to fiscal policy. Then I start to look at it doing its own thing, for example, targeting different types of rates. Now, normally what we do is to interact monetary and fiscal policy to achieve government objectives. Most times monetary policy on its own can't achieve most of the macroeconomic objectives that we want to achieve. The issue is not that we're targeting a particular exchange rate, we're targeting a particular level of stability for the exchange rate, if I can. Like, targeting a particular rate. For example, if you're looking at the Eastern Caribbean islands, you're looking at Trinidad and Tobago, you're looking at St. Lucia, you're looking at these islands, they have a sort of flexible exchange rate regime, but the band that they flex between is narrower than our band, you know. So yeah, not St. Lucia, other islands. So if you look at Trinidad, the band that they flex between is a narrower band, so it sorts of reduce the level of uncertainty for them. But I mean, Trinidad is an oil-producing country. Mexico is also an oil-producing country. Jamaica is a non-oil producing country, so it has implications for us and how we move forward.
So it's yes or no, or maybe.
Oh, well.
We can target both. I think she wants to know.
Oh, you can use fiscal and monetary policy to achieve a host of objectives.
No, that's not the question. That's not the question. Can we target both? Okay, you say it's a range. Okay, and so is inflation. Can we target both?
I don't understand.
Okay, let me go first to this last question and then to some of the previous ones. The answer is, can you target two things with one instrument? And the answer is no. That's a basic thing.
Equation problem.
That's
two unknowns, one equation makes it difficult.
That's a point. Remember a very basic. Forget about the little, let's say, narrative that I said concerning first trying to target the exchange rate, which is non-viable at the end of the day, and then having to try to control inflation because of the not success of that policy. So forget about the narrative and just think about this in more abstracted terms, exactly as Professor Haughton was saying, you need the same number of instruments to achieve any number of objectives. You cannot have one instrument and two objectives. That's an underdetermined system, right? So very abstractly, it's just very easily answered. The economic narrative would be similar to what I said. You try to target the exchange rate. At the end of the day, usually you lose reserves. There will be a currency crisis. The exchange rate needs to correct to adjust the current account. And at the end of the day, you will end up trying to control the inflation effects of that very sharp depreciation. So you go revert to inflation targeting, but you cannot do both things at the same time. So that would be the answer. And there was a very interesting question concerning nominal GDP targeting, vis-a-vis inflation targeting. All of these came out because, let me be very brief about this. There is a very big debate in industrialized economies whether they have a situation of what they call secular stagnation, which is, for different reasons, in the global economy in the last, let's say, 2-3 decades, there has been a very important increase in the propensity to save, a very important decrease in the propensity to invest. This means that the natural rate of interest, that is, the rate of interest, the interest rate that balances investment and savings, is low. And that means a very subdued, let's say, rate of expansion of aggregate demand. That's a macroeconomic equilibrium. That's a real rate of interest. This has nothing to do with monetary policy. Now, if you have a very low rate of interest, that means that aggregate demand, for different reasons, for example, a very old age structure, very low productivity growth, and so on, this means that basically you will probably have a very low rate of inflation. So if you have a very low real rate of interest and a very low, let's say, rate of inflation, you will end up with very low nominal interest rates. So what happens if there is a huge shock to an economy with very low nominal interest rates? This means that if there is a relatively important zero lower bound, which does not mean that the lower bound of a nominal interest rate is really zero. We've seen in Europe that interest rates can go to some negative basis points, between 0 and 1, I would say, between 0 and 1%. This means that all of this debate of nominal GDP target meant that given that there is a zero lower bound and that these economies are working in terms of macroeconomic equilibrium with very low nominal interest rates, there is very little room for monetary policy to react to shocks. So if you go to nominal GDP targeting, that is the sum of growth plus inflation, it gives you a little more space in terms of you can react in terms of monetary policy. That's basically accepting a higher rate of inflation. That's a very, what is contributing to perhaps volatility in the exchange rate. Is it policy mistakes? Well, don't do them. Is it shocks? You can't do too much about that because it's a small open economy. Is it a macro issue or is it a market, financial market issue? You really have to understand what is contributing to exchange rate volatility in order to understand it. Volatility per se, if it's reflecting market, forces and fundamentals, it's not bad. On the contrary, it is making other price variables in the economy less volatile. Let's say that everything is fine, that interest rates are where they should be, the exchange rate is where it should be, and there's a shock to the Jamaican economy. How should the Jamaican economy absorb it? Through exchange rate volatility or through interest rate volatility? That's a decision for society to have and for the policymakers. From the experience that I have, and from many other emerging market economies, let me tell you, the volatility of the exchange rate to absorb shocks is a godsend. It's a lot better to absorb shocks through having the real exchange rate fluctuate than through having interest rate volatility. So again, on the other hand, if all the fundamentals are correct and you have a shock that is not reflecting a changes in fundamentals in your country, but is reflecting that perhaps your financial markets are not deep enough, and there are big players, and these big players are, let's say, taking a different position and so on, then the adequate provision of liquidity in that market is crucial for inflation targeting and for macroeconomic management. And that would deem necessary an intervention. But that would not be an intervention to try to target the exchange rate or to try to, do something that is going against market forces. Basically, it would mean that you have a microstructural problem and that you have to make sure that there is enough liquidity in your financial markets for those markets to intermediate properly any kind of shock. Let me end with this. I think that central banks and governments, policymakers should really, given the type of debate that is taking place here and that has taken place in other economies, should really try to avoid this discussion of the technocrats, those cold-blooded people that make terrible decisions and that put macroeconomic stability before growth, and all of this, I think, a very wrong discussion, and try to make an extraordinary effort to try to explain to its citizens and to its laymen why some policies are preferable to others. And I think that a very important element in that is the correct diagnostics. It's not only in terms of optimal policies, as I was saying at the beginning. It's in terms of what's viable and what policy should be bearing what burden and what other policy should be bearing other burdens. To put the burden of growth, of consumption, of welfare related to consumption on monetary policy, I think is something that should be avoided. Monetary policy should be geared towards doing one thing, which is keeping low, stable inflation, because high inflation is absolutely terrible for a society. It's regressive, it's an undemocratic tax, it's not legislated, as I was commenting, it's absolutely terrible. Now, growth policies, sustainable growth, they have to be addressed by policies that increase productivity. And these are, again, very hard also to take, and in many different societies also merit tremendous discussion about education, about training, about, let's say, wage bargaining setups or institutional setups, even about political choices. What political system should be in terms of the right incentives for there to be correct policy making. But to put all of that burden on monetary policy, to tell you the truth, is really not very reasonable from my point of view. And I think that everybody should all the policymakers should make a tremendous effort in trying to convey that. Because otherwise you're going to be expecting things that are not possible. And I think that's very unfair for those policies to be judged against something that they cannot do. That would be my...
Thank you. So at this point, I'm going to invite Mr. David Bailey, a graduate student in our department, to come and give the vote of thanks.
Head of the Department of Economics, Dr. Nadine McLeod, presenters, Madam Chairperson, Dr. Christine Clark, members of the Department of Economics, distinguished guests, a pleasant evening. Following a stimulating public discussion forum, I would like to take this opportunity to express gratitude to all who have assisted in making this a successful event. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Department of Economics for establishing and building on its relationship with the Bank of Jamaica, out of which has come the actualization of events such as these. Thank you for continuing to play a major role in the development of the knowledge base and critical analytical skills of your audience. To our esteemed panelists, I'd like to express our appreciation to you for taking the time to share with us and providing meaningful and thought-sparking responses to our questions. I would also like to thank media personnel, UWI-TV, for their coverage and technical team for their support for this evening's proceedings. Appreciation is also being expressed to Dr. Alric Campbell for spearheading this public discussion forum. We also express gratitude to the Department of Economics administrative team for organizing and executing this event. Finally, thank you all for attending and participating in this forum. I trust it has been a beneficial experience. As we leave here this evening, let us continue to have these thought-provoking discussions as we seek to continue our contribution to the development of our nation. Have a good evening. Thanks.